Hi, I'm Hendrus. I'm writing for Beyond Skyrim, being a writing lead here and there. And today I'll show you how to write villains and antagonists and how to make them feel unique and what to just expect when having to write characters that you love to hate. And it's going to be great fun. Okay, so first of all, on dealing with evil. First, I'll explain what exactly is an antagonist and what makes them. Then I'll go over different archetypes and just classifications of evildoers of the evil kind. Then I'll give broad tips when writing them. Just what you need to look out for, what's important when concepting them, and how do you really just make them feel good. Then I'll briefly touch upon redemption arcs, because redemption arcs and character arcs in general are just totally fascinating. And it's one thing to have a protagonist undergo an arc, but a villain, that is something really good and really rare. Then I'll just go over general stuff like, if a villain works, they work. What to look out for when writing villains for different genres or different types of quests. And at the end, if we have enough time, we'll do a villainous workshop. Just to get those noggins jogging. Okay, first of all, what is exactly an antagonist? The antagonist is the opponent, the competitor, and the plot device for your protagonist. In broad terms, your protagonist is the main character of your play, of your quest, of your game. And the antagonist, whatever it may be, is the thing that throws stones in your protagonist's way and just pushes against them. They set up conflicts, obstacles, and challenges for the protagonist to overcome. Antagonists in Elder Scrolls are usually a bit different from what you are usually used to, because they have rarely any big agency over the player. When you take Aldrin and Dagoth and Mirren's Dagon, for example, they don't really... So, yeah, sure, they pose a looming threat that, if you don't do the main quest, the world will get destroyed. But as long as you do the main quest eventually, they're gonna wait for you. So there's no time limit on, oh god, if I don't enter Dagoth Earth's lair by 30th of Frostfall, he'll win. That's not a thing in Elder Scrolls, and that's rarely a thing for the minor antagonists as well. So if you have a quest where, I don't know, there's a bear terrorizing the village, if you're too late, the village won't be empty with torn-up corpses. The antagonist is a force that pushes against the protagonist. It doesn't have to be a single person, or even just a person in general. Antagonists might as well be forces of nature. They can be storms, sharks, and even just vague entities like, the split personality, or the darkness that looms. There is a lot of creativity that can flow into creating villains. Or antagonist or a villain. A villain usually has to be evil, but antagonists themselves, they don't have to be evil. If your main character or your protagonist is on the more morally grey side of things, then your antagonist might be the local police force, or just the city guards. So if you're looking at a protagonist that is a thief, a murderer, then your whole conflict will arise from him trying to dodge the local authorities and just be evil, and your antagonists are the good guys. Okay, so now I'll be going over the different types of evil. These are not all the types that there are, just the most common ones and the ones that are most distinct. Because a few villains and antagonists, they just blend between archetypes. And I'll be referring to villains here, just because a villain is something who is morally either grey to darkish or just right out evil. And I'll start out with the authority figure. The authority figure as a villain is completely dependent on the context of the story you're trying to tell. For example, the setting is a school, and your protagonist is a bunch of school kids that run around and just cause chaos. your villain in this regard is probably going to be either the hall monitor or the very strict teacher. And it's less common in fantasy, apart from things like Harry Potter. And they're fairly absent in Elder Scrolls as well, because they are dependent on this structure of authority. So I guess the outlier to that is Mercer Frey from the Thieves Guild questline in Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, because he is your higher up, and he is technically the antagonist for the second half of the questline, or the second and third act. But he's less of a villain and more just he's just more of an annoyance than a villain. Although Bethesda does make it quite obvious that he is evil because he is fairly grumpy. The important thing for an authority to have is power. The authority figure needs to have more power than the protagonist to work as a villain. You can't have the hero be more powerful than the villain for an authority figure type of villain. If you take away their power by, I don't know, demoting them or booting them out of the organization that you're both part of, then this villain ceases to be a villain. Well, the character is still there, and they might be still antagonistic, but they're not really an authority figure anymore, because the main conflict of authority figures as villains is that they usually try to keep the protagonists either in check or keep the protagonists from discovering their dark secret. Thus, the protagonists are often in a very unique position, as being usually directly situated below the authority figure as the villain. And most onlookers would usually just say that this villain is just doing their job. So take again, for example, the teacher, or let's say the villain is the guards captain and you're a guard. From an onlooker's perspective, that villain is usually just doing their job, and maybe they're a bit strict about it, but still, you're their lackey, so to speak. Here's a few examples for authority figures as villains. On the left is Miss Finster. She's a very strict teacher, and that's just kind of it. The protagonists of Disney's Recess are a group of kids that just cause chaos and just want to have fun. And Miss Finster is the opposite of fun. So she just tries to have everything stay orderly and neat and nice and tidy, and they don't want TJ Deadwaller to do anything reckless. Same goes for Gunnery Sergeant Hartman from Full Metal Jacket. He is a drill instructor, and he has to be rough and he has to be evil, but he's probably doing his job a bit too well at the end of Full Metal Jacket. And the same goes for Severus Snape. As you can see, all these villains are just fairly orderly. They are doing their job, and they just tend to be no-nonsense type of characters. Which means that if you are writing an authority figure as a villain, you must kind of make sure that your protagonist is either fairly chaotic and they just like to shake things up, or you have to give your villain like a dark secret that no one can know about to make them actually work really well. The next archetype is the Beast as the villain. The Beast has to be something that is either unleashed or stumbled upon, usually. So, for example, the setting is a dark village in the woods, and the protagonists either stumble upon the stalking thing that haunts the night, or they accidentally unleash it. So without the protagonist, there isn't really a villain in this case. Sure, there might be still something that stalks the woods, but in many cases, the protagonist kind of just either riles it up, or the protagonist just releases it into into freedom. So the plot might revolve around trying to get this werewolf back into their cage. The Beast usually has a good reason to act. In many cases, it's either just the instincts to hunt, or just that it does what it has to do in order to survive. So it has to feast, or it has to kill people to eat them or drain their blood, whatever. Usually, the Beast as a villain has to act out of those things. It's not choosing to act, but it needs to, either to fulfill an instinct or just to satisfy some sort of hunger or lust. With beasts as villains, usually they can be killed. It's just really, really hard. Although there are a couple of villains that can't be killed, or a couple of beast villains that can't be killed, and the whole plot is just, okay, we have to survive this thing, or we have to escape it. And the beast villains usually just, they're the most common in thriller and horror type of stories. Werewolves, vampires, the Wendigo, for example. That's all just a beast that you need to escape or fight. But fighting is really difficult. And once again, the villain in this case has a lot of power over the player, or the protagonist. Right. A couple examples on the beast villain again. First of all, the shark from Jaws. We don't know how it lands there. It's just suddenly in the waters. And the whole plot is just trying to kill this damn thing. Same goes for Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th. Usually he's a bit more difficult to just kill or disable. And mostly the story is just trying to survive him, or his hauntings, I suppose. So he still fits well as a villain. And last up is your regular werewolves. These are mostly the stock standard beast that you encounter in fantasy. And in many cases, the quest either revolves around trying to escape them or trying to kill them. But due to their, I guess, lore significance, they are really tough, and it usually takes a good, to actually kill them, which makes them good antagonists for shorter quest lines. Right, next up is the fanatic. They are driven by extreme ideology and conviction, sometimes both. Oftentimes both. They believe that they are always right and that you are always wrong. They've got fairly twisted morals, meaning that they don't shy away from bloodshed, or they don't shy away from, I don't know, doing whatever they can in order to succeed in their plan. There's an interesting side plot that can happen with the fanatic as an archetype, is that the protagonist isn't trying to kill them, but just to disprove their ideology, which gives them a bit of a leeway for potential character development. There's also an important subtype of this, like, overarching type of villain, which are the corrupted. The corrupted usually are characters that have once been good, but they've fallen from grace, and now they're evil, and they are acting as the antagonistic force. The fanatic is really good for fantasy, action, and thriller, but just in general with fantasy and the whole cult setting, it makes them good antagonists that you can kind of empathize with, but you still really like seeing them get beat down. Great examples for those are Dragon Priests in Skyrim and just Dagoth from Morrowind. The Dragon Priests from Skyrim believe that they are, kings next to gods, which are the dragons, and it's their right to rule this world. And once the dragons return, they can establish themselves once again as the fair and not so nice rulers of Skyrim. Thus, the player has to combat them and kill them from their undeath, I suppose. Well, Dagoth is a fairly twisted villain who, once again, falls under the idea of the corrupted, because Dagoth once was an ally to Lord Nerevar, who has been driven mad with immortality. And Dagoth believes that he is justified, and that's the difference between fanatics and criminals. There's also a type of villain that is just a regular criminal, like, I don't know, your common burglar, or, I don't know, a serial killer. In many cases, the criminals know that what they're doing is wrong, but they do it anyway to either justify, to either just for plot, essentially. Usually, the criminals can justify their their deeds, although they know that they're evil. But the fanatics, they insist that what they do is correct and the right thing to do. But the interesting thing is that deep down, the villain is still a human. Maybe an undead human, but you can still reason with them to an extent. Here's 3 examples as a fanatic, as a villain. Once again, Dagoth the dude stuck in a volcano with a piece of pottery on his head. He believes that it's his moral duty or his divine right to rid first Morrowind and then the entirety of Tamriel from his enemies, who's everyone but the Dunmer. Then there's John Doe from the movie 7. He's a serial killer who believes that his actions are justified because his targets are, as he believes, the personifications of sin and evil. So he sees himself as the good guy trying to rid the world of evil. But inadvertently, he's a serial killer, so he's pretty much evil. And lastly, there's Zuko from Avatar. He starts out as a fanatic in Book 1, and most of Book 2 as well, where he has his little change of heart and a redemption arc, which I will be covering later. So Zuko falls really well into the idea of the corrupted, who started out as a, not so bad dude, then got a scar and was sent to hunt the Avatar to regain his honor and his place. Next up, Mother Nature. Mother Nature is also known as a force of nature type of villain, or just an antagonist. They can't really be called a villain because they don't really are that biased. Mother Nature as a villain is unforgiving, all-powerful, and unstoppable. You just can't beat that thing. You either have to flee, or you have to hold out and try to survive. But fighting it is impossible. And it's really well suited for horror, drama, and thriller type of settings, where the protagonist from the get-go has very little power. Mother Nature is pretty much just the all-powerful villain. And some villains that achieve their master plan and have total world domination might also fall under Mother Nature as a villain type of character. Despite it being called Mother Nature, it doesn't have to be all natural. Mother Nature as a villain can also apply to failed experiments, or demonic, or I guess extraterrestrial life forms, or just things that are. They don't play favorites, so no one is really safe from them. They can be incredibly unforgiving, but if the protagonist is able to overcome them for some reason and for some matter, it's always paying off. Here are a few ideas for Mother Nature as a villain. First of all, it's the Twister from Twister. It's literally just very powerful tornadoes. You can outrun them, probably, but try to stay and you're gonna have a bad time. Next up is the Mist. This is one of those not so natural things, and so the Mist is a huge wall of just mist and just fog with weird things lurking inside. And if you try to combat it, you're probably going to get grabbed by a lot of tentacles, and you're going to get dragged into that thing with no one going to see you again. And last one, my personal favorite, good old Cthulhu. He is, or they is, I don't know what they, it doesn't matter. Cthulhu pretty much is the all-powerful demigod being, or godly being, that you can't fight once it's unleashed. You might try to contain it again, if it's ever possible, but if even seeing this thing is enough to drive a man crazy and insane, it's going to be pretty difficult of a task. Next up is one of the favorites from many writers. It's the anti-villain. Anti-villains, they aren't really well, they might seem evil, and they probably are evil in many cases, but they're also really sympathetic. Might it be their charisma or just their personality. These guys are fun to watch as a viewer and just fun to experience as a player and as the protagonist. They are the type of antagonists that you want to see again and that you want to fight again. In a few instances, the anti-villain is the good guy, just with some immoral tendencies. Usually the anti-villains have fairly justifiable goals, and even few of them have a noble or good side. The anti-villain is actually fairly close to being an anti-hero. It's just that the anti-villain is as little of an antagonist as an anti-hero is a protagonist, if that makes sense. So, for example, if you would follow this anti-villain as the main character, they would be really easy to just convert into a protagonist. Well, one of the protagonists with a less noble outlook, but still, they are fun around, and they always, sorry, not always, but they're often just in the forefront of your story. So, if you have a quest that deals with an anti-villain, you can make sure you can make sure to have him pop up every now and then again. They fit well with the idea of the mastermind archetype, who might be directing things out from the shadows, but you just see them often, and you get to know them. You get to know their morals, their outlook on life, usually, their backstory. Maybe it's a tragic backstory, and sometimes the hero might even need their help for something, which makes an interesting dynamic if villain and hero have to band together to fight a common enemy, or to just put their squabble aside to focus on the really big, bad evil that is looming on the horizon. Examples for an anti-villain. Hannibal Lecter. He is a serial killer and a cannibal, but he actually comes around and helps the protagonist. Isn't that nice? The moment the viewer sees them, they know that he's different. He is encountered first in a asylum, and it's a great scene, and everyone should watch it. He just really feels evil, but also really interesting, and that's what keeps the viewer interested in them. Same goes for Patrick Bateman. He is incredibly charismatic, although he is a serial killer, once again. And while he also falls under the idea of being almost a protagonist at this point, he also just oozes personality, and that keeps the viewer watching, and that keeps the protagonist also interested in trying to pursue them. And lastly, we have Andrew Ryan from Bioshock, who is just trying to do his own thing, but unfortunately the player suddenly crash lands in his city, and he sees them as a threat to deal with. So if for other circumstances, they might have helped the player, or just helped out in general. And usually you just work, usually the protagonist just works to stop their evil deeds themselves. Maybe put them under lock and keep them in a prison, not to just outright remove them from life. Next up is one of my personal favorites, the femme fatale. She's not really seen in media that often, but when she does, she leaves a great impact. The femme fatale is a really classic villain type that is just an attractive and seductive bringer of disaster. The archetype was really popular for the film noir, but since then she has kind of fizzled out of relevancy, unfortunately. In many cases, the femme fatale brings about as much power as the protagonist, often working together with them. But the femme fatale always tries to either manipulate the protagonist or to seduce either them or a different character in the play or in the quest, and just exploit them for her own gain. In many cases, the femme fatale is very close to the anti-villain, and she's also just really fun to be around, usually. The character is selfish and works for their own good, and they're not always evil, they're just pushing against the protagonist in that they're trying to work with them and just, in the end, exploit them. Basically just a female James Bond. Good looking, in many, many cases female, and whenever she gets involved, there's probably going to be a lot of chaos inbound. A few examples for the femme fatale. Elizabeth from Bioshock Infinite. She has the unique position of being your companion and working alongside the protagonist. But everywhere she follows, trouble also seems to follow suit, which means that if the femme fatale in this case in Bioshock Infinite wouldn't have been there, the player, as in Booker DeWitt, would have had a much easier time through Columbia, and it's just always fun to be around a femme fatale. Next up is Astrid. She's probably less on the seductive side and more on the trying to play the player, trying to just exploit them and trying to use them for their own gain, which in this instance, or in this example, would be to keep being the head of the Dark Brotherhood and to send Cicero and probably the Night Mother to Sithis and have them never return. The last one would be Dr. Elsa Schneider from Indiana Jones. Her deal is that she tries to gain information from Indy, and she always pops up as a innocent bystander, but it's always she doesn't expose herself as a villain until way, way later in the movies. Next up is one of the most fun villains to write, the pure evil villain. They are simple, they are self-aware, and they're usually incredibly smug about it. And it's just great to write one. The pure villain archetype knows that they're a villain. They know that they're evil, and they revel in that. They have a contagious confidence, are really smug, and since they know that they're evil, they are also immune to character development. In most cases, in many cases. As an on-viewer, or just as an onlooker, they are so satisfying to just watch unfold. It's great to just see them revel in their evil schemes and have the monologue about how they're going to take over the world once they have disposed of the protagonist, and you can't stop them, and then they trip over a wire and the whole plan goes haywire. And it's fun to see them succeed, but it's also really fun to get them to just see them get their asses kicked. They are extremely awesome in getting the protagonist moving and just rugged as this looming threat that's the pure evil archetype. They are actively trying to disrupt as much as possible and trying to have to give the protagonist as bad of a day as possible. They don't need intricate backstories, and they don't care for their own backstories. For example, there is the Joker in Batman that tells different stories to different people on how they got their scars, their scars, and there's many instances where he manipulates Harlequin, who is a psychiatrist and thus very interested in his personal backstory. He just uses his own backstory to get her to also become evil and then just join him in his quest for chaos. And you can just see that they're having so much fun with it. One issue, though, with the pure evil archetype is that they are extremely brittle because they rarely change each other. In many instances, they can but not have to have a breaking point where they just crumble and fall apart. 3 examples for the pure evil villain. One is Cruella de Vil. There we go. She just wants to murder puppies for their fur. And she doesn't care about morals. She doesn't care about money. She just wants that fur coat. And she wants it really bad. And she is willing to kill over 100 puppies for that. That is pure evil. And we don't really care about her backstory. We just want to see her fail. Or just want to see her just interact with different people. Same as Manamako in Elder Scrolls. Elder Scrolls Online kind of changed that by giving him a really intricate backstory with Galerion. Well, it kind of already happened in Oblivion. But when you're talking about an Elder Scrolls villain who is not a Daedric prince, usually Manamako is the villain to go for. He is an evil lich, and he wants as much power as possible, and he could not care less about what any emperor might think about him. And lastly, we've got good old Sauron, who's the whole reason why Frodo does his epic journey to Mordor, where the shadows lie. And he is a good looming threat. And it's, while we don't get to see much of him, he is really imposing. And the catharsis when the tower crumbles as the ring gets destroyed, you just feel good to finally see Frodo succeed, and Sam. Well, more Sam than Frodo in many cases. Next up is writing evil. The first thing you have to consider when writing your evil character is you want to establish the power balance and the power difference. The villain always needs to hold more power than the protagonist, but that might shift, actually. And you can just... Power is not really set in stone. It might be political power, it might be money, military might, it might be authority. Once you take that power away, the villain kind of stops becoming a villain. And you can be totally creative in how you give your villain power. In The Dark Knight, Joker mentions that he terrorizes Gotham and brought it to the brink of breakdown with just a few bombs and some gas, which shows that depending on how you play your cards, the villain might actually be a bit underpowered. So, in The Dark Knight, the Joker isn't really a physical fighter. He doesn't hold any authority. He has no henchmen, no lackeys, well, rarely. But he still is powerful because he knows how to play his cards right. The power dynamics between hero and villain can also shift mid-story. So nothing is really stopping you from having the villain kick the hero's ass until the halfway point where the power dynamics shift, and either the hero gains... They gain a friendship power boost, and now they can kick the villain even harder. And, the power dynamics have changed. That's totally fine, as long as you don't do it too often. And nothing really says that the protagonist has to react to the antagonist. It might also be vice versa, where a villain sees what good the hero is causing, and they just don't like it. Or let's say your hero is a thief, and they have stolen the antagonist's priceless family heirloom. And now the antagonist is out to get them and get their sweet, sweet revenge. It's just that both antagonists and protagonists, they have to drive each other forward by just clashing constantly. That's what makes a good villain. And that's what also makes it interesting for any viewer or player or onlooker. You just want to see these personalities clash and just interact with each other. especially if your protagonist and your antagonist have really distinct personalities. Like, I don't know, they're really confident, really flamboyant, and just seeing their antics is immensely satisfying to witness. Next up, the redemption arcs. Villains are characters, and characters can have character arcs. It doesn't even have to be a redemption arc. It can be anything. As a typo. Anyway, villains can also just change on their archetype. Let's say your villain starts out as a burglar and they find some sort of artifact that renders them immortal. You suddenly have probably a pure evil character or a force of nature character. And you can just, as easy as that, give or just take their power away and they become something else. You can play with that. Character arcs leave an impression because characters are interesting to see evolve, and it's more interesting to see them just turning into a friend. That's what keeps Zuko such an endearing character. They start out he starts out as a villain, and at the end of the story, he's the closest friend to the other. Well, he's one of the closest friends to the Avatar, and a great asset for them. And now here's how to turn a foe into a friend. The most important thing for a villain to have is a weak spot. Not for redemption arcs, but for writing in general. If you have an overpowerful villain, you might want to give them a weak spot to help the protagonist fight them. In Zuko's case, this is his family and just the role that family plays for him. Since Zuko is basically split in like half his family is evil and half his family is good. Usually that's how it's portrayed. And the villain can walk this tightrope. And what happens if the villain falls off that tightrope? That's when the villain might see their errors and might see the struggle. How does someone react who has been taught into believing that they are the supreme ruler and everyone of the family is always right? And then they learn they're not always right. My family is flawed and people are also flawed. And you just push your character over the edge. It might also be mid-battle, for all we care. You can be creative with that. But the most important thing to show when you have a character arc or a redemption arc is to show their struggle. The reason why Kylo Ren's character arc and his redemption arc didn't work was because they did not show the struggle. You need to give a character time to gather the thoughts, to struggle with the clashing personalities, with clashing informations, with clashing convictions. And you just have to give them room and time to breathe. Without that, the redemption arc doesn't hold up because it's not believable. A believable character needs time to develop. You can't just have the villain talk to one random person and, now they're good. That's not how it works. That's boring storytelling. It's so much more interesting if your villain gets beaten down, stepped on, and then they have an epiphany. Hang on. Maybe this works. Maybe that works. Maybe I'm not who I'm supposed to be. Or what happens if their mentor figure leaves or dies? Villains are characters, and you can play with them. That might sound a bit sadistic, but characters are there to explore really creative territories. Might be with having them break down and then step on them again and then step on them again, just to help them up and see the character reform and just see how different personalities just evolve over time and over the course of your quest. It's Skyrim doesn't really show this, actually. You have villains that don't really change. I can't recall a single villain that questions their own confidence, because many villains in Elder Scrolls they're pure evil. They have rarely any backstory, and they are super confident that they are indeed the World Eater, and it is their right to rule the world, and it's theirs for taking. And be creative, have fun with your characters. But there's one small silver lining with that. Be mindful of your arcs. It's really difficult to get a pure evil character to change into a good guy without them losing what makes them interesting. If you have someone who's really confident and the thought of losing or being evil or being good doesn't cross their minds, they are there to rule the universe and the galaxy and to destroy everything. You can't really put them into the good guy's shoes without breaking what makes them unique and awesome. Sure, you might have the pure evil characters form an alliance with the hero, but it's way easier and way more comfortable for a writer to slowly change evil into something else. Might be good, might be morally grey, but it's really it's just really different. It's just difficult to have pure evil characters and just other archetypes just change on the spot. You have to commit to the archetypes first before you can change them. And lastly, if it works, it works. Writing villains is all about what you need. If you have a 5-page miscellaneous quest about a bandit who has robbed someone of their chickens or their sweet roll, you don't need to write 500 pages of backstory on them. You don't need to know what they're, what makes them them. They're an evil bandit that the player needs to slay. Just establish what you have to do for the villain to work. If you are writing a intricate questline of 3 to 4 quests, it might be good to have a backstory for the villain. That maybe they've been a farmer, and maybe they've been a baker, and they've been trying to bake a sweet roll, but they just can't. And then something clicks, and now they're evil, and they want to steal all the sweet rolls in the world. That works for a villain who's longer there than like a dungeon delve, really. You can always do better with writing characters. Be creative. Make them feel believable. Make them feel human. Give them personality. It's always just it's such a great shame when you have a really cool concept and it's not explored enough. Once again, the Dragon Priests of Skyrim. They are evils, liches, sorcerers, undead, whatnot. And they're there and they're evil because they want to rule the world. And we don't know anything about their past, apart from Mordecai, who may have had something to do with South Aren, but that's all boring. And you can do so much more better if you take a bit of time and just think around like a corner or two. Make them feel human, make them feel believable. Do they have any allergies? Do they have any fears? Any uncommon characteristics? Something that the player or the protagonist might even just exploit. Let's say your villain is allergic to apples. And there's this hidden feature that if you sneak an apple into the inventory, and next time they eat it, and then they die. And that's interesting. That's a cool way to structure a quest. Maybe have a little note somewhere on the table saying that, villain can't eat apples. Or, that last time that I bought some groceries, the big bad bandit chief touched the apple and his hand got all blistered and swollen. That's something to exploit. That's interesting storytelling and just interesting quest design. And if you have a really powerful villain with a big amount of henchmen, you might want to think about what makes the henchmen follow him. Did the villain create the henchmen? Is it a death cult where the villain is the cult leader or the evil god, or is he part of a prophecy, or maybe he's just rich and he pays them good. That's stuff to think about. And the most important thing about writing villains is have fun writing them. They are awesome to write, and it's just great having an established villain that you can revisit and revisit, maybe for a quest or 2 or 3. And it's just great coming up with evil, because usually the protagonist is good guy, and that has been done to death. And you can turn a villain into a comedic villain as well. Dr. Draken from Kim Possible, amazing villain. He is fun to be around. He's fun to watch. It's fun to see him fail. It's also fun to see him just interact with people. Alvin, not so much. He's a dragon. He's a big dragon. That's cool. But that's kind of it. Dagoth awesome to be around. Vivek, awesome to be around. Have fun, be creative, and be evil with that. Okay, do we have time for a bit? We do. Apala, that is too much. There we go. Last up, the Villainous Workshop. If you are still interested in writing villains, now it's up to you, and see what you can write and what you can do. It's great. Be evil, be creative, and be the villain number 1. And for that, I've prepared a little task with about 10 minutes time. Do we have that time? We barely have. Yeah, sure. So here's the task. I've created a small prompt for you, and I want to see how well you can use that to be creative and just to have fun with something. You've got 10 minutes to write a small paragraph on the villain to just explain the backstory a bit, or just, establish a villain. You've got about 5 to 10 sentences to work with. Less is more usually, but don't go overboard. Don't write like 2 pages on a villain. And now you can craft your own antagonist. Just start a Google document and write, create your villain, and then post it in the game writing channel. I've got my eye on the lecture hall chat, so if there's any questions for the villain writing or just in general, just ask. Your time starts now. So yeah, if there's any questions, feel free to ask them. Yeah. Okay, bad question. In what ways could villain interact with the player, show their personality? That's up to you. The most standard or the most used one is that the villain has caught the protagonist, and now they are going to do their evil rambling. So the personality can either be shown through actions or through dialogue. Maybe they clash head to head, and your villain just shines through their personality. Maybe they're really snarky. Maybe they have caught the protagonist, and there's this whole evil monologue thing that you all know and love. And or it's just how the villain treats the henchman. Maybe you're not fighting the villain first, but the henchman. And the henchmen just say that, they've got no race. Man, isn't that swell and isn't that good? And that villain is really charismatic. That's just all up to you. Show the personality while the villain is left or for boss fight. Yeah, it's you can have them show up during a boss fight, or just stand on that cliff in the corner and just shout at the protagonist really loud. Cliches are there to work with. For And stereotypes exist for a reason. You can work with them, and you can use them as a small springboard to just leap into the pool that is good ideas. You can set up really interesting encounters by kind of pointing towards the stereotype and then just doing the entire other thing. Maybe the villain caught the protagonist, but that's not really the villain who caught the protagonist, but it's the henchman who tries to play the system and come out at the top. Who knows? You can be really creative with that. Yeah, I think it just has to depend on the medium or the type of quest that you're on about. It's a bit more difficult in Elder Scrolls titles because you rarely teleport the player into like a cage. But if you do, that's interesting because that rarely happens. As long as you keep an eye out for any cheesing that the player might do, nothing's stopping you. For example, there's this one encounter in Skyrim. I keep forgetting the name of the dungeon, but basically he is an evil sorcerer who has set up his lair directly beneath a word wall, and the player falls through a trapdoor, and suddenly they're caught off guard. I mean this. Let me quickly scroll up a bit. You've fallen for my trap. Yeah, that as well. Yeah, just you can pass if you want to. It's non-compulsory. You can do whatever you want. Be evil. Be creative. Nothing is forcing you to stay in and do the workshop. It's just an idea. Just something fun at the end. So yeah, any other questions perhaps? I did mention that there's a lot of different characters or just archetypes. These like 7 or 8 that I showed, it's not everything, but it's just the ones that usually stick out the most. There's the henchman, there's the evil mastermind, there's the really snarky sidekick to the villain. There's the god just plays with you archetype. Oh, it's not an archetype, it's more just it's just fun. Oh, your favorite villain archetype, let's see. I think the favorite one to encounter would be either the pure evil or the anti-villain, just because they stick out the most to the player. Although I guess having been played by a femme fatale is also really awesome. You have this companion, or you have a female character who's by your side all the time, and then something happens, and boom, they're evil, and they've robbed you of all your septums. And now the quest is on to catching that evil woman and getting your septums back. That's also really fun, and it's just what works. The pure evil character, they are so flamboyant and they are so stock confident in their own abilities. Let's take Vegeta from Dragon Ball, for example. He is the Prince of all Saiyans, and he is fighting against a lower class Saiyan, and he gets his butt handed to him every time, but he's still so goddamn confident, and it's just really fun to just see him try to get the upper hand, then be surprised, and then just land with the nose in the dirt again. One thing I don't think I actually touched upon is the idea of the third act breakdown. That's what you can do with a lot of more pure evil-ish characters. They don't have to be pure evil, but just really, really evil. That works best. Where they are beaten down and they're on the ground, they're crumbling, and you can just see their confidence crumbling along with them. And this leaves them open to character development. So if you want to have a pure evil character have a bit of character development, not much, the third act breakdown is the way to go. As long as you as you stay careful to not have him suddenly turn good without any incentive, I guess. For example, it took Zuko like the entirety of book 2 and a lot of book 3 to kind of come around to the idea that maybe he shouldn't catch the Avatar. And Vegeta went through a lot to not actively try to kill him or to kill Kakarot or Goku. We're getting the first people writing in game writing. Let's see. A faint clicking of gears and steam is heard at first. Then it gets louder and louder until finally the villagers are deafened by the noise. The steam starts to unfurl, revealing a dwarven centurion. But this was no normal centurion. No, this one was 10 times as big, pieced together with various pieces of scrap metal, and was oozing out a noxious green gas. However, this was nowhere near as scary as the sight that lay behind it. A legion of Thalma marching in a messy formation, clad in chorus carcasses and refitted with dwarven gear, accompanied by their trademark choruses, some of which were large enough that they even were being ridden as war chariots. The Nords had forced the Snow Elves underground so many years ago, and now the Thalma would return the favor, not resting until all of Skyrim was put 6 feet under. That is great. That sounds awesome. We've got this huge steam golem that, while not really sentient, is just really imposing. I think robots and mechas would probably also fall under the idea of a beast archetype, while the Thalma are more or less the lackeys. That actually rarely happens in media. Usually, the guy in charge is sentient, and they are charismatic and have a silver tongue. And yeah, that's interesting. Let's see what else. Anna Gwyn is a scholar of magic-seeking artifacts, forgotten in Nordic and alien ruins thought to be empty. Anna Gwyn secretly stalks you as you journey through ruins and watches you leave after finishing the dungeon crawl. The scholar is calculating and standoffish. He will steal any items you fail to notice or can't get to due to being a fight. Anna Gwyn will attack should you come across something of extreme value that he fails to swipe. He will stop at nothing to gain arcane artifacts. That's interesting because that there's an archetype that's called the Equal. And the whole conflict between the Equal and the protagonist is that they are pretty much even in their power. So the protagonist might fight them, and then the Equal goes, you have but scratch me, this is but 10% of my power. And then the antagonist powers up, and then the protagonist says, but this was also just 10% of my power. And then the protagonist powers up. And that sounds great. And I think I'm on time.